Welcome to Igniting Imagination. I'm your host, Lisa Greenwood. This season, we're exploring some of the questions church leaders are asking in this moment. Through our work at Texas Methodist Foundation and Wesleyan Impact Partners, we have the privilege of walking alongside congregations and organizations as they discern faithful next steps. Whether we're talking about learning and innovation, generosity, investments, loans, grants, or organizational health, our hope is that these conversations spark your imagination for what faithful leadership can look like in your own context. Today's conversation explores a question many of us have never thought to ask. Can the way we invest our resources become an expression of our faith? As followers of Jesus, as people of faith, we know the importance of being generous with what we have and being good stewards of what's been given to us. At our best, we think carefully about where we give our money. But we tend to spend far less time considering where our money is invested and what it's doing while it's there. Yet our investments have the potential to shape companies, communities, and even the future we're helping to build. To help us explore that conversation, I'm joined by two leaders who have spent their careers thinking about the intersection of faith, investing, and long-term stewardship. Derek Casteel is Director of Investor Services at Texas Methodist Foundation and Wesleyan Impact Partners. He works closely with churches, nonprofits, and institutional investors to help them steward financial resources in ways that support both their mission and their financial goals. He is a valuable member of our team. I'm excited for you to get to know him. I'm also joined by Jake Barnett, Managing Director of Sustainable Investment Strategies at Wespath. Jake leads Wespath's work in investment stewardship and sustainable investment strategies, helping faith-based investors think deeply about how their investments can reflect both their values and their responsibilities in the world. Wespath is our investment manager, and I've really enjoyed the opportunity to get to know Jake and the work he is doing. In this conversation, Derek and Jake invite us to think about investing in a broader way, not simply as a financial decision, but as an opportunity to participate in God's work of human flourishing. Whether you're responsible for your family's investments, serve on a church finance committee, or have simply wondered whether your investments can reflect your faith, I hope this conversation expands your imagination for what faithful stewardship can look like. So let's listen to our conversation. Oh, I'm so excited about this conversation. Welcome, Derek.
Thanks for having me.
And welcome, Jake.
Great to be here.
All right. Before we get into questions about investments, I want folks to get a chance to meet you. So, Derek, share with us a little bit about what drew you into investment work, and particularly related to the church. And then, Jake,
Sure.
I'll ask you the same thing. Derek.
Well, to go back to the very beginning of my career, I attended Florida State University, and I was a political science major. And one of the benefits of being a poli-sci major at Florida State is that the state capital is in the same city as the university, Tallahassee. So I was able to do an internship for the Florida House of Representatives my final semester of my senior year, which would have been 1996. And it was an amazing experience. I met a lot of wonderful people, and I learned a lot about how things work behind the scenes. But at the end of the day, I became so disillusioned with how the whole political process works that I decided that that was not the field that I wanted to have my career based in. So kind of just as a fluke through somebody that I knew, I ended up getting an entry-level job at an investment bank in St. Petersburg, Florida. Worked there for 3-4 years, ended up on the bond trading desk, and eventually befriended a member of the team who relocated to Chicago. He later recruited me up to Chicago in 2000 to work in an investment consulting firm where we were advising a number of institutional investors, mainly in the nonprofit space, and found that work very gratifying. Eventually worked for another couple of for-profit investment advisory firms. The last of which specialized in the impact investing space, which was really kind of when that whole idea of impact investing was in its infancy. That would have been 2006 to 2009, but I really found that to be rewarding, and eventually ended up at Wespath, where Jake is now, working on the investment team, and really found that to be rewarding as well, working with churches and pastors and other church leaders, and then ended up working with, I ended up where I am now with a kind of a dual role with the Texas Methodist Foundation and Wesleyan Impact Partners, talking primarily with finance committees and endowment committees of churches that invest with us.
That's great. All right, we're going to dig in more to some of those pieces, some of those threads that you've mentioned, but thanks, Derek. Jake, what drew you into this work?
Yeah, so similar to Derek, I really had the experience of kind of falling in love with economics, and not so much the political science side, although that was obviously of interest. And really this idea of how could economics be something that was used to advance social and environmental positive impact. That was a curiosity from back in high school from a wonderful economics teacher, Mr. Hockey. And followed that throughout college, explored what that would look like in multiple different fellowships and internships after I graduated. Did AmeriCorps Vista with a microfinance group here in Chicago. Had a wonderful experience volunteering for an orphanage in Ghana for 6 months, and then came back and did a public affairs fellowship in St. Louis. And at the conclusion of that fellowship, I really wanted to dig into a career that felt like it was going to be kind of honing my professional skills and advancing some of the interest areas that I really wanted to explore, and ended up at Morgan Stanley, where I was a financial advisor, then institutional consultant focused on working with clients that were really interested in sustainable investment. And that intersection for me actually introduced me to the faith-based community, specifically the Catholic women religious. And had the really meaningful experience of supporting multiple different congregations for about 7 years at Morgan Stanley. And towards the end of that, I was kind of feeling like I'd learned what I'd learned as in the wealth management industry, and wanted to directly participate in the faith-based community that I'd become increasingly embedded and excited about. And so looked for different opportunities, and thankfully there was an opportunity at Wespath, where the pension fund for the United Methodist Church, based here in Chicago, longtime leader in sustainable investment. And so applied and have been here for the last 6.5 years or so.
Great, great. And you are leading the way and really helping change the conversation, I think, about investing. I want to dig in a little deeper with you about this notion of sort of, I hear people talk about faith-based investing. And what do we actually mean by that?
Yeah. So faith-based investing is really the practice of seeking to express your faith through the decisions that are available to you as an investor. That could be choosing which asset managers you want to work with, who are oftentimes, in a 401k, you're kind of choosing different asset managers, and they might have different tilts when it comes to how they approach issues that are relevant to faith, whether that's what they exclude from the portfolio or what they deliberately decide to lean into investing in. It could also be how do they use their voice and engage corporations and policymakers on your behalf. So oftentimes these types of decisions are touching upon values that are important to the faith tradition that people are practicing. For example, in the Christian tradition, obviously, we have values around love your neighbor and care and consideration of others. And so how are you thinking about how that translates to specific topics like affordable housing? And are you actively seeking to invest and support your neighbor in how you invest, how you use your voice, what you exclude? So really, it's just at its core, it's about how does your faith inform the decisions you make as an investor?
Yeah. And making those decisions through the lens of faith makes so much sense.
It does. It does.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's important too to just name, we at Wespath are obviously fiduciaries as well. And fiduciary is just a fancy word, basically meaning that we need to be thoughtful about managing the money in a way that serves the financial interests of the beneficiaries and clients that we invest, that we're entrusted to steward that money on behalf of. So there's this interesting blend in what we do in terms of we're trying to advance our values. We're always needing to do so at Wespath in a way that is also kind of best in class with what we consider the most prudent allocation of capital for those people that have entrusted their assets to us. So that's a constant conversation for us about what does this look like in practice.
Right. It makes sense. I mean, in a way, you're holding both of those because you really have a fiduciary to both. You have this financial fiduciary responsibility to bring responsible returns to your investors, and a sort of missional fiduciary responsibility to align with the faith and values of those investors, and that makes a lot of sense. And so when those feel like they're in competition, you've got to be really faithful about what that balance looks like, and that makes a lot of sense. So, Derek, you work with every day with churches, with finance committees, with investment committees. What kinds of questions should those folks, those leaders, be asking themselves as they think about investing?
Sure. Well, at the kind of the highest level is to identify the asset pool that they're considering investing and asking themselves, what is the purpose of these assets? What will we eventually be spending these assets on, and when will that spending take place? And if there's multiple answers to that question, to those questions, it oftentimes makes sense to divide those pools up into multiple pools or investment accounts that each would have their own asset allocation model associated with them. So, for example, with a typical church that I've worked with, oftentimes there are operating assets or rainy day fund assets that might fall into those operating assets that are set aside for funding current operations, and also set aside for replacing the roof when it reaches the end of its useful life, or the HVAC system, things of that nature. Generally speaking, it doesn't really make sense to invest in a kind of a long-term or endowment type approach for those types of assets, because that would mean exposing them to equity and bond market volatility. So typically those types of assets are invested in kind of money market types of investments or other short to intermediate term debt investments.
Like impact certificates at Texas Methodist Foundation or Wesleyan Impact Partners, for instance. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you for the plug. And then on the endowment side, generally speaking, what I've observed folks to do is to emulate what we at the Texas Methodist Foundation are doing with our own permanent endowment assets. And that is investing within kind of a 65-35 model. So 65% to equities, 35% to debt strategies, 15% of which is in our impact certificates. And that other 85% is invested in Wespath's institutional funds, which we feel are very professionally managed and proactively incorporate the values of the various Methodist denominations into their investment process.
Yeah. So I'm hearing you say, like, how you invest, like in what instruments, really has a lot to do with what you want those dollars, what you need those dollars for. Like, what's their purpose in terms of your church's mission and your church's needs. I'm just curious how those conversations go, Derek. Like, do they talk about their values? Do they talk about their mission as a church?
Yeah, so in those conversations, it's very common for folks to be mindful of the fact that their church, oftentimes in the not too distant past, received a loan from the Texas Methodist Foundation or from Wesleyan Impact Partners. And that loan was made possible by churches and individuals investing in the impact certificates that provide us with the capital to originate those loans to them. So there is, I would say, first and foremost, there's oftentimes kind of a deep sense of obligation that, hey, you know what? When we were shopping for a loan to renovate our sanctuary, we went to the local bank and they wanted to charge us a really high rate. And we went to TMF and they gave us a much more attractive rate and much more attractive terms, lower fees, et cetera. And so we feel a sense of obligation that now that we have liquid assets that we're considering investing, that we would look to TMF to be able to do that. I think there's also a sense that they like the idea that they're helping the broader church community of which they're a part by investing their assets with us, because they know that when they do so, that we're going to turn around and originate another loan or more loans to other like-minded churches such as theirs.
Yeah, it is a kind of impact investing in ways that have an impact.
It is, and impact investing oftentimes is given a lot of different definitions. I've kind of come up with my own. I like the idea of that it's channeling capital in a way that improves the human condition. And then I like to add on to it a little bit in our sense, specifically in our sense, in that we are originating loans to churches that they may not have otherwise been able to have obtained through traditional banking channels. So when you look at the traditional banking industry, most loan officers don't know how to assess the risk of a church as a prospective borrower. And so they're generally not lining up to be able to originate a loan to a church. Moreover, if that loan were to go bad, heaven forbid, most traditional banks don't want to face the bad publicity of having to foreclose on a church that they made a loan to that went sour. So it does allow us to kind of operate within an ecosystem where, again, we're channeling investor capital to places that it wouldn't have otherwise reached if we hadn't put ourselves in the middle as that intermediary.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think that's a really great example of impact investing, helps sort of clarify what we mean by that. And I know, Jake, in the world of Wespath, like this is like one specific example, but I think you guys are thinking about, the whole portfolio. And I'm curious how a faith-based lens or a lens toward impact or human flourishing surfaces in the midst of how you all think about asset allocation and, this fiduciary that we talked about earlier. Like, talk a little bit about how it impacts the whole portfolio and the decisions you all are making, really.
Absolutely. I think that, one of the wonderful things about working for a faith-based institution is that we do have this formal call to consider both the fiduciary consideration and how are we aligning with our values, as you stated earlier, Lisa, in terms of kind of holding that tension and navigating those what might seem divergent, but oftentimes there's a heavy overlap between how we're thinking long-term and being stewards across the board, whether that's financial stewards or the type of stewardship that John Wesley calls us to. And when it comes to how does that translate to our decision-making, I might give 3 different examples, which is Wespath has an invest, engage, and avoid model. And the investment is really, where are we directing capital? And the values alignment question there is, are there opportunities for us to direct capital in a way that are positively impactful? That's a big part of our conversation. And I'd say the best example that we have of that is our positive social purpose lending program. And that program is over 35 years old. It focuses on affordable housing, community development, and global microfinance. It's particularly prominent in affordable housing. And in its 35 plus year history, it's allocated over $2.2 billion and helped to support over 53,000 units of affordable rental properties. And those properties, one of the things that I'm really excited about in terms of what our team does there is those properties often have wraparound social services. So they could be additional support for the elderly or for individuals with disabilities or for veterans. So that's really the ruby in the crown, as I describe it, of our impact investment program. In engagement, we've got a long history of using our voice as a prominent institutional investor to advocate that companies take strong action on issues like how they're treating their workers. A recent example of that is we've had an ongoing engagement with Dollar Tree. Now, something I often say in relation to this is I doubt very many people have walked into a Dollar Tree recently and said, gee, I don't think this company could be run any better. There's oftentimes a recognition that there's probably some improvement. But the kind of darker side of that story is that there are actually some employee safety issues that we're starting to raise up because, for example, their stock rooms would be overcrowded. With only one employee there, something tipped over, they could get stuck. And so there were multiple OSHA violations that led to investors engaging the company. And we've seen some really strong improvements since that engagement and since multiple votes passed at the different dollar companies. And so we're seeing distinct measurable improvements through that use of voice and engagement.
I just want to jump in while you're still at Engage, because you all had a role in that.
Yes. Yeah.
Will you just say a little word so folks can hear?
Absolutely. So one of the things that's really meaningful to me personally on being able to participate on the asset owner side is that as opposed to when I was an institutional consultant, and I was 100% commission, there wasn't really an incentive to collaborate with other people. It was very much a, get what you can and make sure that you're growing your business on an individual scale. Asset owners tend to be much more collaborative with each other, including institutional asset managers. And so that engagement was through a coalition called the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. It's over 50 years old. It's really a pioneer in shareholder engagement. And so they convened this engagement with Dollar Tree. There was actually a shareholder resolution, which is basically a vote that's put forth at the company's annual general meeting that passed in the early 2020s. And following that engagement, the company came back to the table with investors, including Wespath, to kind of talk through how they really implemented this in a thoughtful way. And it's been one of the more constructive engagements that we've had over the last several years on issues like worker safety and employee engagement.
Yeah. Okay. Invest, engage.
And then the last one is avoid. So avoid is really where do we want to not invest? Once again, to refer back to Wesley, that's oftentimes connected back to the do no harm element of what he spoke to. And so the United Methodist Church has given us 6 areas in the that are common amongst many ecumenical investors. So I think these are largely similar with Protestants and Lutherans and many investors you'll see. And those 6 areas are seeking to avoid private prisons, adult entertainment, gambling, weapons, alcohol, and tobacco. So in each of those areas, we seek to screen out companies who derive a significant portion of their revenue from those businesses. And that's really being an example of where the United Methodist Church has told us to kind of explicitly avoid in the interests of do no harm.
Nice. I appreciate that. Thanks. I'm curious as I kind of want to go back to this question that I asked Derek and ask you, Jake, like, what are some of the questions that finance committees or investment committees ought to be thinking about if they want to align their values and their faith with their investment decisions?
Yeah, I think there's one piece that I always emphasize is just to approach some of these conversations with humility and curiosity. So in the context, something I'll often start a conversation, whether this is with an activist or a very traditional finance investment committee chair, is acknowledging that there is no kind of perfect and pure example of a portfolio that's going to be exactly aligned with faith-based kind of value sets, because There's inherently an element of eye of the beholder in that, because having spoken to a lot of different United Methodists, there are a lot of different perspectives on what values alignment looks like. And that's true even more so when you expand it to ecumenical partners. But I think that oftentimes, whether it's an individual discerning what they should be doing or an institution discerning how they want to be approaching values alignment, I think the conversation becomes, first off, discerning what's important to you. So is it that you all personally really care about affordable housing? You all have talked about the excellent work you do on the impact certificates and church property, and we personally really appreciate what you all are doing there. Could it be social justice or access to healthcare, whatever it might be? I think it's about looking at what the value set and the issue set that you really deeply care about, and then looking about the decisions that are available to you as an investor. So it could be, who do you partner with to operate as your institutional investment consultant? That's a really important question as to how you're going to be implementing, because you want a values aligned partner. Or if you're managing it yourself, how are you choosing the asset managers that are often deploying the capital on your behalf in different asset classes, as Derek spoke to earlier, and asking, are they being thoughtful partners with you on the issues that you care about? But I think the two separate conversations of discerning what issues you really want to focus on, and then discerning what levers you have available to you to exercise those values, is important. Because ultimately, one of the most powerful things you can do as a steward of capital is amplifying to your partners that these values, that these issues are important, that you take them seriously, and that they're going to be a material factor in deciding who you give your business to. And so if I was kind of going to give one piece of advice to everyone, it would be that make sure you're expressing the question, advocating for your values in those discussions with whomever you're partnering.
Yeah. Both of you have talked about, as we think about what committees, what leaders in the church ought to be thinking about, both of you have really referred to a real clarity about identity and purpose and values, which interestingly comes up in so many themes of what we're talking about, whether we're talking about philanthropy or we're talking about leading in the neighborhood or we're talking about even evangelism, and now here we are talking about investing, and it comes back to a clarity of identity, purpose. What's the difference God is calling us to make? Who is our neighbor? How are we going to be a neighbor? Like, those questions really, they form the basis of decision-making around investing, who your investment managers are going to be, but also that asset allocation and what do you need to be able to access in a short term? What do you need to access in a long term? And then how are those invested for the difference making that you feel called to? Anyway, I'm just noting that here we are back to identity, purpose, values, kind of at the core. I'd love to know, and Derek, I'm going to come back to you on this because you've just been working just on the ground with churches over, really, I don't know, the last decade, I guess, more than that.
Yeah,
even.
14 years or so.
Okay, yeah. So what trends are you watching today that are really giving you hope for the future around faith-based investing?
So I think one of the most encouraging trends that I'm seeing when talking with churches has a lot to do with Generation X and millennials slowly replacing the baby boomers in leadership roles on the finance and endowment committees. And when you look to a number of surveys that have been conducted over the years, one of the most often cited one is the one by the Hoover Institution and Stanford University a few years ago that looked at the extent to which boomers, Gen Xers and millennials were incorporating socially responsible funds into their investment portfolios. Boomers, the older age group, were only at like 20%. Among Gen X, it was a majority. And among millennials, it was a significant majority, close to 80%. So it was like 20% versus 80% versus, when you're comparing boomers to millennials. So what you can take away from that, and by the way, those surveys have been repeated by a number of other organizations, Morningstar, Cerulean Associates, and many others, and they've all basically found the same thing. What that tells me is that it's becoming increasingly important for members of younger generations to incorporate their personal values into their investment portfolio, whether it be the investment portfolio that they have a fiduciary duty to oversee on behalf of the church that they attend, or if it's their own personal investment portfolio that's comprised primarily of their retirement assets through their 401k or 403b plan. So I think that's very encouraging. I will say also that I just feel like, in talking about some of the examples that Jake had provided in terms of the shareholder engagement activities undertaken by Wespath to promote the Wesleyan values within the various Methodist denominations, I can just tell you from experience that those types of anecdotal stories, when I tell them to members of committees, resonate much more with the younger folks than they do with the older folks. And I've been doing this 14 years, so I've got a pretty big sample size to draw from. So I would find that encouraging as well.
Yeah. Interesting. As we think about those generational shifts, we've said for a while now, talking about how some of the, gosh, I hate to say older generation because I'm right up against it now, but let's just say silent generation and even boomers defining stewardship around kind of a save and protect mindset, whereas good stewardship for Gen X and younger is really about how are we being generous with our dollars in a way that have an impact. Both can be generous. It's not really about that, but one is about how do we protect this for a rainy day? How are we being good stewards of it in that way? And the other, the younger, is, being good steward means I am using these dollars to make a difference in the world. And it feels like that's tracking with what you're saying in terms of how we invest as well. That's interesting. I hadn't made that connection before.
Absolutely. And I think there's probably a number of different reasons for this. If you're 62 years old, so you're 3 years from hopefully retiring, and your financial advisor proposes something new to you, a sustainable investment approach that's going to invest in green companies. That unfamiliarity might seem more risky, and you may be more risk averse if you've only got 3 years before you're going to start drawing money out of that account. Whereas a much younger individual is much more willing to take that risk because I've got 30 years until I'm even going to touch that money. So I'm willing to take a risk on something that I believe deeply in. I think that probably there's other things at play as well. I'm going to editorialize a little bit here in that, I tend to believe, and you all would probably observe this as well, that boomers and the silent generation tended to be much more trusting of large institutions, the governments, corporations, et cetera. Whereas folks in my generation, I'm a Gen Xer, Generation X, millennials, et cetera, have just been bombarded with so many media revelations of really poor behavior, objectionable behavior that, politicians and or corporations have engaged in, that they feel that the whole system is broken and needs to be fixed. And I think there's a hope that by investing in a certain way, in a sustainable investment strategy through a manager that has values similar to their own, that maybe they really can make a difference by allocating to those types of strategies.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that makes sense. So, Jake, are there trends that you're watching that are giving you hope?
Something that I would say is giving me hope, and also just I think is a really important question for those of us that are part of worldwide churches to ask is, what is the broader worldwide perspective on some of these questions? Because oftentimes, my experience has been very U.S. centric in terms of the clients I served when I was at Morgan Stanley, and also just, Wespath as an agency of the church cares deeply about the worldwide church. Most of our participants are based in the U.S. But Lisa, you took part in a really rich conversation that we had last year, almost a year ago now, talking about this kind of one specific part of the United Methodist Church Constitution, which dictates what sustainable investment should look like. And it was this really rich 2-day conversation with a number of stakeholders, including a number of activists who have often been pushing Wespath to include more exclusions within our portfolio. And while we didn't come to a singular definition of faith-based investing or what it means to be a faithful steward, one of the pieces that came through really loud and clear and that we took on very seriously is, how do we make this a worldwide discussion when we're talking about what does it mean to invest as a faithful steward? And one of the trends I've seen from that question, and us, we've hired somebody from we've hired somebody and we've set off kind of a whole work stream relating to investing as a faithful steward and engaging the broader worldwide church in these conversations. It's been really rich. And one of the questions that's come up is, not only are there differences, as Derek was speaking to, in generational understandings of stewardship, but there's also differences in geographic understandings of stewardship.
Right.
And often, one of the questions that will come up first and foremost when speaking to an audience, for example, in Africa, is less so about some of the typical areas for debate at General Conference, our quadrennial legislative session around fossil fuel exclusion or human rights exclusions. And it's more so, how are you investing in the economic development of my region? How are you helping generate jobs and community development in my kind of specific neighborhood and community? And so I think there is conversations not only generationally, but kind of geographically for us to have on some of these topics that'll be really rich and will hopefully help us do all of this in a more thoughtful and connectional way moving forward.
Well, super helpful to hear y'all talk about some of the trends that you're watching, but also really how it's shifting generationally, but also regionally. And this worldwide perspective, like I'll say, there are some areas of our lives where we really think about worldwide perspective. And I'm not sure we always do with investing. I think we're so US centric. And so just good perspectives that you all are thinking about all the time. And so I appreciate that. I want to move us to rapid fire. If someone listening wanted to take one faithful step toward aligning their investments with their values, where would you encourage them to begin?
I would say find a question that whoever you're working with, oftentimes people are working with intermediaries to help them deploy their investments, whether that's retirement funds or institutions. Find a question you're really passionate about in terms of an issue of the day, and go and engage that provider, go and engage whoever that partner is, and just listen with curiosity, listen with a sense of kind of authentic commitment to your own values, ask follow-up questions. I think people can sometimes get a little intimidated by the understandable complexity of finance, but ultimately, if you do have an investment pool, it is your right to ask how those assets are being stewarded. And so I think it's important people just ask the question.
Great.
I think it's important that the individual asking, whether they're asking the question on behalf of themselves and their own personal assets, or on behalf of the church that they may be serving in a fiduciary role on behalf of, I think it's important that they attempt to identify an individual that has expertise within the impact investing space. Because I will tell you that in my experience, a vast majority of folks in the financial profession, through no fault of their own, don't have experience in this space. And so what you might end up getting back from somebody is, oh, well, we'll just put you in this mutual fund that screens out the sin stocks. Well, that doesn't really have a meaningful positive impact. It might make you feel good. But if you're really wanting to move the needle, I think it's important that you talk to somebody within the profession that specializes in this area. Of course, Jake and I are both eager and willing to talk to anybody that's looking to learn more about this topic. And if they're interested in an impact investment strategy that we don't offer, super open to the idea of connecting them with an organization that does offer a strategy that works for their portfolio.
So that's a good lead-in. How can folks connect with you?
Well, thanks. So my contact information is listed on both of our websites, WesleyanImpactPartners.org and TexasMethodistFoundation.org. Please feel free to give me a call or email me, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can.
Yeah. And they can find you under the investments tab, meet our team. Yep. Great.
Similar
Jake?
for Wespath.org, and that's WESPATH.org.
Yeah. And we'll put a link in the show notes so folks can find you. And I so appreciate you two. Thank you for being here.